Well, hello again, and the story of Russia continues. Ivan the Terrible now is dead. He had 4 sons, right here. The one who was supposed to inherit the throne, Ivan as well, who was supposed to be Ivan V, was killed by his own father. The eldest son, Dmitry of Russia, only lived a year, so he died in childhood. He still had another son by a mistress, and his name is Dmitry. He mysteriously was killed in the town of Uglich, and it is this Dmitry whose name will be taken up by the so-called pretenders, of which we'll talk in this lecture. And as a result, the only son that was left was Fyodor I, who will not rule long, and during his rule, well, someone else will rule in his stead, because he was a weak man, but he did inherit the throne of his father. In his stead will rule the man by the name of Boris Godunov. He is very well known in the West because of the great opera that was written by Mussorgsky. Modest Mussorgsky wrote the opera, wrote the music, and he based it on the novel in verse by Alexander Pushkin, a great Russian 19th century poet. So that's why Boris Godunov is very well known. He will be married to a sister of Fyodor, and that gave him sort of a step up onto the throne. His second wife will be a sister of Malyuta Skuratov, the leader of the Oprichniki. And thus will begin the time of trouble, because they'll just essentially, there will not be a legitimate heir on the throne, and as a result there'll be all sorts of people who will claim the right to be on that throne. We'll start with Godunov. I mean, there's not much to say about Fyodor, because he was just a figurehead, and Boris ruled in his stead. And then at the death of Fyodor, he will in fact be crowned Tsar. He was his brother-in-law and trusted advisor. He was a leading boyar, and as I said, already during the life of Fyodor, he was a de facto ruler anyway. So he was crowned Tsar, but his position caused unrest, especially with the clan of the boyars by the name of Romanovs, who will ultimately become Russian Tsars. They just felt that their family was ancient enough, and an upstart like Godunov should not be sitting on the throne of Russia. As a result, the head of the family, of the Romanov family, he will be exiled and forced to become a monk, and his wife will be forced to become a nun. But there were a lot of factions, even apart from the Romanovs. There'll be a lot of factions, and so he will, as a result, he will not be able to accomplish much during his 6 years on the throne. But as I said, his name is very well known because of the opera. So the whole Romanov clan was accused by Godunov of having used witchcraft, and also attempting to usurp the crown. So Theodore Romanov, as I just said, the father of the future Tsar, Mikhail, was forced to become a monk and expelled to a distant monastery where he was imprisoned. It also did not help Godunov at all that during his reign, and while he was attempting to stitch the country together, an absolutely devastating famine hit the land. between 1601 1603 for a couple of years. Contemporary scientists seem to find the cause of that famine in the eruption in Peru, actually, in the year 1600. So the temperature stayed well below normal during the summer months, and often freezing at night. So the crops essentially just died, crops failed, and about 2 million Russians, a third of the population, which was about 6 million, perished during famine. So as you can imagine, the one-third of the population perishes. There's no one to engage in military campaigns. There's no one to pay taxes. Economically, militarily, the country is in great disarray, as if it weren't already before, thanks to Ivan the Terrible's policies. The famine also caused people to flock to Moscow for food supplies, and that, of course, strained the capital greatly, both socially and financially. And then another thing will happen. This Dmitri, who was Ivan's son by his mistress, because Maria Nagaya, even though she was from a noble Russian family, she was Ivan's mistress. She was not one of his wives, and she birthed a boy, Dmitri, who mysteriously, at the age of 9, died in the city of Uglich. And there was a great suspicion that was Boris Godunov who murdered him, who sent the assassins to murder the boy. So this Dmitri will then, his name will be taken up by the so-called pretenders. And so just as the famine began to ease off, then when one of those first Dmitris will appear, and there'll be a number of them. He appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, claiming that he was that Dmitri, claiming that he was not in fact killed, that he was hidden by some loyal servants, that he then lived from monastery to monastery, and then ultimately found himself in the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth. And there he was taken up by nobility who wished to war on Russia. They saw this pretender's appearance as an opportunity to regain both land and influence in Russia. And they assembled about 4,000 troops that were comprised of Russian exiles, Lithuanians, the Cossacks again, and they began what will be called the Dimitriad Wars, because there'll be other false Dimitris as well. Boris Godunov will die in 1605, at which point this false Dmitri will in fact enter Moscow at the head of his troops, and will be greatly welcomed, because someone far away is always more welcome than someone right there on the throne, because one doesn't know anything about someone who is far away, and someone right there in front of one's nose is also always guilty of one thing or another. So Moscow welcomed him with open arms, but that again will not last long. Here's the opera that I told you about. It's called Boris Godunov. It's gorgeous. It's a gorgeous opera. By all means, if they stage it again, it's highly recommended. Opera by Modest Mussorgsky, and it was composed in the second half of the 19th century in St. Petersburg, and it's based on the drama in verse Boris Godunov by Alexander Pushkin. And here it is. This false Dmitri, as I said, will be very welcome in Poland originally, and particularly in a family of a general by the name of Mnishek, and he will in fact marry his daughter Marina Mnishek, and that's another little boutique story in the Russian history about the romance between this false Dmitri and Marina Mnishek. And well, as I said, he entered Moscow in 1605, but he reigned there for less than a year when he was killed. And so the pretender's murder. And the fact is, people who backed him were very diverse in composition, because the boyars who backed him hoped for the restoration of their ancient privileges and the lands that were confiscated from them by Ivan the Terrible. Then the petty nobility wished for greater land grants and more money, and certainly a tighter grip on peasantry, because I mean, Russia was an open territory, and the more squeeze was placed on the peasantry, the more they ran away. By this time, they pretty much were already tied to the land. They were indistinguishable from slaves. But there was always an opportunity to run away, with that caveat, however, that if originally there was a year that was allowed for the serf owner to search for an escaped serf, now it was indefinite. 10 years, but then indefinite. That could be searched. But many of them did run to the south and joined the Cossacks. Now the foreign mercenaries, the Poles, the Lithuanians, they, well, obviously they wanted their pay, they're mercenaries, so that's what they want to do. And then the Polish themselves, the clerics and Lithuanians, I mean, they were Catholic. And they certainly always hoped for, if not conversion of Russia, then at least joining the Catholics and the Orthodox together under the guidance of the Pope. And one of the reasons for the downfall of false Dmitri, in fact, because as I said, he was welcomed with open arms. But as he entered Moscow, he did not follow the Russian ways. Now, Russians were very stuck on their certain traditions, and he just flaunted those traditions all together. The clothes he wore, again, the clothes the women were considered scandalous. The way he behaved himself was scandalous. The way he openly laughed at Russian customs was scandalous. I mean, all of that just accumulated, and he was seen to be completely unacceptable. And finally, as I said, he was murdered. Now, and the leader this time of the insurgents that put down this particular false Dmitri was one Vasily Shuisky. Now, the Shuisky family, again, they were descendants of some of the Mongol nobility, but now they were Russian nobility, and with some Rurik blood in them as well. If you remember, Rurik was the first Norseman who came to Russia in the 9th century and established the trade route from the Baltic to Constantinople. So it was Shuisky now who upheld the interests of the nobility, and he was elected Tsar this time. His reign, however, also did not last long. So here's our Shuisky, right here, and he became known as Vasily or Basil the Fourth. He was a Rurikid prince with the drops of Mongolian blood, who staged an uprising against false Dmitri. He ruled about 4 years, but even though he was a representative of the upper boyars and the landed nobility, but now the lesser gentry was not happy with him, with the new ruler. And as a result, there'll be one movement after another against the Shuisky rule, and another false Dmitri will appear, and then he will establish his own capital in another Russian city. Meantime, the Poles and the Lithuanians also wished the second chance, at Moscow, and some of the rebels offered the crown to Polish king Sigismund, to the Polish king's son. But when Sigismund, in fact, found himself in Moscow, because they did go back to Moscow, they did assault Moscow again, and they did take Moscow again. And when he found himself in Moscow, he wanted the crown for himself. So while Shuisky was still technically king, so there was Shuisky, a king, and then Sigismund, who was Polish king, and there was still another false Dmitri at the same time. In the process, Shuisky will resign. He will just leave the crown, and these years, essentially with the empty throne and wars between the Polish-Lithuanians and Russia, will exhaust the already exhausted country altogether. And the struggle over who would gain control of Moscow became so entangled and so complex, and no one really knew who was in charge, and nobody was in charge of the armies. And here again is the map, if you're interested to look closer at the forces that were involved at the time. And yes, the country was exhausted, and was really at its limit by the end of the first decade of the 17th century. So within 5 years after Boris Godunov's death, all the powers had just shifted entirely. And here you have the boyars quarreled among themselves over who should rule Moscow while the throne remained empty. So that was one faction. The next faction were the Catholic Poles. And these are the forces that finally occupied Kremlin in Moscow and Smolensk, not far from Moscow. So there the Polish forces were very much present, and they clamored for power. Then the Swedish forces, they had taken over Novgorod, the city that was to the west of Moscow, in retaliation for Polish forces attempting to take over Russia, essentially. And then there were also the Tatar raids that were coming from the south with the scorched earth techniques, and leaving thousands of people dead and taking thousands of people into slavery. So the situation was truly horrific. Needless to say, nothing was built at that time, and no icons were painted. And then finally, 2 men were found in Novgorod who were able, by the force of their personalities, to take the matters in their own hands. So one of them was a powerful Novgorodian merchant by the name of Kuzma Minin. Here he is. There he is. And together with a prince, Dmitry Pozharsky, so it was a merchant and a prince who finally rallied enough forces to push back the Polish forces from Russia. And as a result, November the 4th is known as the National Unity Day. And here is the statue. I think it was cast in the 20th century, and Minin is standing right here, and Pozharsky with his sword and his shield, Pozharsky is sitting. And that's the statue that sits in front of St. Basil's in Moscow. And so one of those very rare national assemblies came together. It was called Zemsky Sabor, sort of a land assembly. And there were many pretenders again, there were many possibilities for the throne of Russia. But finally a man was elected who was the son of that Theodore Romanov, who was forced to take orders and expelled to one of the distant monasteries. His son, by the name of Mikhail Romanov, who really didn't distinguish himself in in any way. In fact, one of the reasons that his candidacy was promoted was because he was completely insignificant. The envoys who took the decision to him after the National Assembly made that decision, they couldn't even find him. They had no idea where he was. So he was a distant nephew of Ivan the Terrible, and there is some Rurik blood that was present in his veins, and he became, in 1613, he became the first Russian Romanov Tsar. And he became Mikhail the First Romanov. And the Romanov dynasty will rule in Russia, well, until 1917. So for 300 years, the Romanovs will rule Russia. But the extraordinary thing about this election, that despite all the turmoil that shook the country for the last 15, 20 years, the new Tsar was not given any limitations on his power at all. It was the same old autocracy as established by Ivan III and then his grandson Ivan IV. And he was invested with the same absolutist powers as were so far part of the Moscow Tsardom, so to speak. And I mean, in fact, despite all the hardship and the hunger and the devastation and death and torture, in the end, the country's political and economic structure did not really change during all that anarchy. It was just more exhausted, but it essentially remained the same. And so under the Romanovs, a police state just gradually defined itself as the institutional expression of the absolutist theory. And as such, it will continue for 300 years until it will be dethroned and replaced with a much more brutal regime, with the regime of the Communist Party and another Ivan the Terrible. Mikhail then had a son by the name of Alexey, and he will become Alexey Michailovich Romanov, and he will rule for long years, and he will be the father of Peter the Great. He was extremely pious, again, on the surface, because ultimately he will pretty much rule the country as pitilessly as anybody else. It was not as horrific as under Ivan IV, but pitilessly nevertheless. And the tightening of landowners' grasp on the peasants will be greater and greater. And the peasants will not even be attached to the land anymore. They will become the property of the actual landowner, and as such, his slaves. And Russian slavery will not be abolished until 1861, at the same time as American slavery, except the Soviet Union will reinstitute slavery. In other words, it will send millions and millions of its own citizens to the gulags, to the concentration camps, where they will be subjected to unimaginable hardship and building of Soviet electric stations and building of Soviet infrastructure, all done by slave labor. But back to Alexei. So very pious, very observant of Orthodox rites, and it was under him that still another upheaval will happen in Russia, and that one will regard the church. By this time, the Russian church indeed was extremely feeble, and obviously the time of trouble didn't help, and also the fact that Ivan the Terrible confiscated most of its lands with the serfs on those lands did not help. So it was feeble in many ways. Politically, because it was completely and entirely subjected to the state power, and that will always be the case. A Russian church will never be separated from the state. In fact, it will be one of the arms of the State Department, really. Morally, because it's total devotion to material self-aggrandizement, which, as I said, wasn't working out because Ivan the Fourth confiscated so many lands. But Alexis, this Tsar, will give the church plenty of land because of his own devoutness. And then dogmatically, because of its rigidity, the rigidity that maintained the superstructure, which allowed absolutely no self-assessment whatsoever. And then there appeared a patriarch by the name of Patriarch Nikon, who was very much venerated by the Tsar, because the Tsar was very pious. So this Nikon undertook a reform of the church, because, well, we remember that Constantinople was now in the hands of the Ottoman Turks, so Constantinople didn't count, and it was felt in Russia, certainly by this patriarch, that it was his duty, in fact, to reform the church. The only thing is that it wasn't really a reform, not anything like the Protestant Reformation or the Counter-Reformation back in the 16th century in Europe. It was simply just a return to certain ancient practices that were deemed to have been forgotten, and the practices of the parent Byzantine school. And really it just consisted in some minute changes in the texts, which, well, obviously by years of copying and copying and copying, especially by people who were essentially illiterate. Yes, obviously mistake always creep into these copies. The spelling of Jesus' name was to be changed, and that was in the old variant it was Isus, Isus, and in the new one, in the new variant, two I's, Iisus, also Isus, Isus. Then the use, what was important, the use of three fingers to cross oneself instead of two fingers, as the old believers did, etc. So, I mean, these changes were absolutely minute, and there was really no reason for great aggravation, but nevertheless it created literally a popular revolution in Russia at the time. This is also a 19th century painting by one Kivchenko. Patriarch Nikon proposes new liturgical books with some changes. In the process, Nikon not only condemned the old books and absolutely forbid the usage of the old liturgical books, but he also forbid the use of the so-called newfangled icons, because he felt that the stature and rigidity and solemnity of the old Byzantine icon was greatly compromised, and therefore the new icons were not allowed to be used. He inaugurated a house-by-house search for these newfangled, as he considered them to be, icons, and what was newfangled and what was not was essentially only in his own mind. And these icons then were confiscated, and their eyes were gouged out, and then they were exhibited in the streets. And if any family or any individual protested, they were to be arrested, and their eyes would be gouged out, and well, the punishment would be extremely severe. You know, a typical Russian approach to change. He also forbid the construction of the tent-like churches, of which Saint Basil actually was a great example, but Saint Basil's was not demolished. But plenty of other churches were, the ones with the tent-like roof as opposed to a domed roof. So a lot of them were demolished, and the new structures were built in their place. And he himself was so ruthless that, well, obviously it explains a ruthless reaction to him. And the hatred that the old believers, as they came to be known, the old believers, the one who stuck to their traditions, the hatred that they bore the very name of Nikon, as you can believe also. And you can imagine the way Russians treat their icons, treated their icons, as we talked about it. I mean, it was a member of the family. It was a member of the family who was there at dinners. It was part of the tradition, and well, these men just come in and take something that's greatly cherished by people and destroy it. And you can imagine the reaction to this. This is an icon which shows the influence of the 17th century Dutch style, and in the 17th century Holland became a great mercantile power and extremely wealthy state, and the merchants themselves wished for art. Well, the Catholic Church did not exist there anymore. It was the Protestant Church, and the Protestant Church upheld the Second Commandment. But the merchants, however, wished for small paintings and wished for their own life to be depicted, and a great number of still lives and portraits and just lives of the merchants were painted by brilliant artists, the artists who understood the behavior of light, the artists who understood how to convey light, the artists who understood how to convey natural appearances. So the 17th century Dutch art was quite extraordinary, and because of the connection with England that was founded by, well, by the English really, and with the open arms by Ivan the Terrible, these influences came to Russia, and such influences are hard to resist, and so they found their way into the icon painting. But this Patriarch Nikon was very much against that, very much against the Western influences. And this strain will also continue into the 19th century, later into the so-called Westernophiles and Slavophiles. So Patriarch Nikon was entirely against all such influences, and this icon is lucky to have survived. Here's another one which is actually really lovely. It's also 16th, 17th century Annunciation, and one could just see the influence of Italian Renaissance here, because there is an apparition of distance, of some foreshortening, some light diffusion, a beautiful, beautiful scene at the bottom of the swans. The whole thing could be painted in sienna, really, so I think it's just really lovely. But and so the contrast between the triviality of these reforms, because I said the changes really were trivial, there were no great reforms, but the incredible violence that they produced and with which they were opposed, it also indicates the degree to which Russia in general was isolated from humanizing influences. Clearly they were there, the influences were there, but they were individual influences. It certainly was not the general tone of the land. And so this virulent concentration on such minutiae, which was really unconnected with any dogmatic changes, because dogma was not changed like the Protestant Reformation, not at all. But it also illustrated, to a degree, a purely magical aspect of Russian worship and of the formulae of the Russian Church. So that was quite interesting. To oppose Nikon, the Patriarch Nikon, there appeared a man who was, he was a priest, a Russian priest, protopop he was called, and his name was Avakum. And Avakum was an old believer, and rebelled entirely against these new minutiae. Didn't see the sense in them because the essence was never changed. But as a rebel, he was persecuted. He was sent to Siberia on several occasions, and on one such occasion, he spent something like a decade in a dugout behind the polar circle. I don't know how he survived. He was brought back, but then ultimately he was burned at the stake. He was a talented writer, however, and he wrote the life of Avvakum, the story of his own life, in fact. And it had such a great impression on the readers that Russians call him the founder of Russian literature. As I said, he was burned, and after he was burned in 1682, the old believers, and actually Russians in general, began to venerate him as a martyr. A painting by Sergey Miloradovich, and that too was painted in the 19th century, about Avvakum being exiled to Siberia, and a number of his followers, a great deal of his followers, joined him in his exile. And this is still another painting, end of the 19th century, by Patriarch Nikon, about burning of Avvakum. You probably already have a sense that that Russian painters love painting historical instances from the history of Russia. But Avvakum was certainly not alone, not just he and his followers. A very substantial monastery there in the White Sea as well. And it was very famous, Spaso-Preobrazhensky Monastery, on one of the islands in the White Sea. They also rebelled against these new service books, and the monastery for long years it was besieged, and they couldn't take it. So it really ended up being betrayed by someone on the inside, and 30 monks were put to death in an unequal battle, and then another 26 were executed, and whoever survived were later imprisoned. That massacre actually shook a lot of foreigners who left memoirs of that, and who left the account of the events in their writings, and that's why we know quite a bit about it. The painting, again, 19th century painting by Miloradovich, Black Cathedral, a rise of the Slavetsky monastery against the new books in the year of London's Great Fire, 1666. And here's the monastery as you see it today. It is, as I said, it's located up there also in the White Sea, very much to the north, in the Slavetsky Islands, one of the largest Christian citadels in northern Russia. It was later, by the Soviets, it was converted to a prison, and it was a prototype of the gulags, and actually many songs were sung about the horrible conditions of this prison. And here is one of the manuscripts, one of the contemporaneous manuscripts that depicts the massacre of the participants in this uprising. Now, Avvakum and the monks very much in the monastery, and Avvakum's followers very much considered this Patriarch Nikon as a precursor of Antichrist. And an extraordinary thing happened. There occurred this endemic mass suicide by burning, because the dissenters, they felt that if they follow Nikon's reforms, so to speak, they will then burn in hell. They completely and utterly believed that, so they felt that burning themselves, self-immolation, was better than being burned in hell, because as they killed themselves in protest, then they became martyrs, and then the gates of paradise will be open to them. They considered this martyr's death preferable to being burned in eternal fires. And in 20 years, about 20,000 people burnt themselves to death. It was really just an extraordinary occurrence. Again, another painting by Michailov, Self-immolation of the dissenters, also 19th century art. But what's really most astounding in this whole occurrence of the old believers versus the new believers, as it came to be known, was that there was really absolutely no intellectual base in either the reforms or the opposition to reforms. Some people compare, say, Nikon's reforms to Protestant Reformation in Europe, and then the old believers' reaction to it, to the Counter-Reformation. But there are no similarities there, really. Well, there are very, very few similarities there, because when Protestants in the West, when they shook loose of Catholic Church, I mean, there's no question that, of course, horrors happened, and the religious wars happened, and thousands of people died. All of that happened. We cannot deny that all of that absolutely did happen. But they also ultimately turned upside down the entire universe of thought and usage. They inaugurated civil disobedience that could never be tolerated in Russia. This struggle, and their struggle was waged in the name of certain definite principles, not just little minutiae about how many fingers to use in crossing oneself. And also the Protestant Reformation inaugurated Catholic Reformation, which too will change the thinking of the Catholic Church quite significantly. And ultimately it will invigorate it as well. While for all its incredible blind violence, the Russian dispute produced nothing but these various sects that were moldering in both sort of dogmatic and intellectual quagmire. And that's the great difference. Yes, thousands of people died, both in the West and in the East. And it's horrible, either way. Yet, in the West, when things calm down, great intellectual renewal that accompanied the original Renaissance that appeared in the 14th, 15th century in Europe was reinvigorated and affirmed, which obviously did not happen in Russia at all. Russia entirely missed, as we discussed it, Russia entirely missed the great heritage of antiquity, because when Christianity came to Russia in the year 1000 about, it came in a very poor Old Slavonic, which did not really develop. It did not come with Greek language. The Russians did not learn Greek, and without the language, obviously, the achievements of ancient Greeks did not come with religion. And then by allying themselves with Constantinople and the usual hatred of Rome, they completely isolated themselves from the West, in the sense that they will certainly miss the Renaissance. But even before the Renaissance, when Europe began to wake up around the year 1000, at about the same time as Russia received Christianity, but the medieval history that occurred in Europe with the waking up of thought and the waking up of the intellect in the West between the year 1000 and the year 1500, Russia missed all of that altogether. And even with these reforms of the so-called new believers, absolutely no fresh wind blew into into the Russian lands. In the end, all of this cost both the Patriarch and the monarch very, very dearly. The monarch, the Tsar Alexey Michailovich, his great power policy collapsed very soon because he was defeated by Poland. There was still another war with Poland. He was defeated there. The uprising, there were several horrible uprisings. One was Stepan Razin, the uprising of the Cossacks and the peasantry. Another one was Vasily Us, another great popular uprising. Then the monks, as we had seen, of the Solovki monastery. Then there was the death of his wife and 3 children. He will have 14 children, but a number of them will die. So the death of his wife, whom he clearly loved by all accounts, among whom was the heir to the throne, another Alexei, that knocked down his health considerably. So the birth of Peter the Great, and he was born in the summer of 1672, was actually marked by the first mass self-immolations of the old believers. The peak of these immolations was in 1679 when 1700 old believers burnt themselves in the city of Tobolsk, just in one city, in one burning. It seems unbelievable, but according to a number of historians, it appears that during the reign of Alexey Michailovich, of this Tsar, the struggle against the old believers claimed more Russian lives than the war with Poland and the uprising of Stepan Razin, which was an enormous, huge uprising. So this religious struggle took an enormous amount of lives. Another painting by Miloradovich, the trial of the Patriarch, and he was in fact tried. And here we have it, by the birth of Peter the Great in 1672. For centuries before him, Russia truly presented sort of a combination of dreariness, coarseness, brutality, complete witlessness, ignorance, debauchery, drunkenness, illiteracy were universal. And illiteracy was just as universal in the upper classes as it was in the lower classes. Very few people knew how to read, even fewer knew how to write. I mean, ignorance was just totally profound. Secular reading was not allowed. It was, well, there wasn't anything to read anyway. But one couldn't even import books from the West. Well, no one read Latin or Greek for that matter. And well, and no foreign languages, even spoken foreign languages, no, it was just, they were not known. And so we have it, while the West discovered Euclid, medieval West, while they discovered him in the 12th century, Russians heard about him only in the early 18th century, 600 years later. Names like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, they might not have existed altogether because, I mean, no one knew about them. Anyone expressing any doubt concerning Greek orthodoxy was liable to either Siberian exile or to the stake. And that was the country that Peter the Great inherited. And it was scary. The degree of ignorance in the country was quite scary. And so here we have it. So our Tsar, Peter's father, Alexey Michailovich, he had 16 children. This is a painting of him choosing his bride. And the winner of the land-wide contest organized by Boris Morozov, the Tsar's closest advisor, and the winner was Morozov's own relative by the name of Maria Miloslavskaya. So she became the first wife of Alexey Michailovich, and she will give him 13 children, and then she will die, and 3 children will die with her. But then he will marry again. He will marry Natalia Naryshkina from a very old Boyar family, and he will have 3 children by her. So he will have 16 children in all, and Peter the Great, Peter the First, who will be known as the Great, was number 14, and the second wife's first child. Well, here we've arrived now at the 18th century, and we will start with Peter the Great next time, and the 18th century will see a great deal of Western influences, finally. Life will change in Russia entirely, in every respect. St. Petersburg will be founded in the year 1703, and that's where I was born, not in the year 1703, but in St. Petersburg. Well, with this, thank you very much, and I will see you soon.